for joining Peter and I today for an introductory session to our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion cards, helping users engage with EDI considerations in their research projects. We're delighted to have this session as part of the Diversity Festival today. And actually, well, the Diversity Festival has been going off for the past couple of weeks. So this session just seemed really timely to do that. For those of you online, you will realise that we have started recording this session. I put round in my joining instructions that we'll just be recording for the main presentation today, and then once we move into Q&A, then we'll stop recording. So Peter and I will just introduce ourselves.
I'm Dr. Peter Craigon. I go by the pronouns of he and him. I'm sort of, well, as you might see by the sort of quite tall, sort of short brown, slightly greying hair. Wear black t-shirt and dark coloured jeans today. Deborah?
Fantastic, thanks Peter. So I'm Debra Fearnshaw. I wear glasses, I've got short dark blonde wavy hair, and today I'm wearing a black top, and probably I'm hoping you can see me okay on screen, but in presenter mode we can't tell. So that's a very brief introduction of us. Just for those who may wish to use it, we have the ability on Microsoft Teams to turn on live captions. We know that they're not 100% accurate, but if anyone would benefit from those, you can just go into the little button that has the 3 dots above it and it says more. And if you scroll down, you can see the turn on live captions, which I've tried to demonstrate with that little yellow arrow on the screen now. So if anyone would benefit from that, please feel free to use it. So to start the session today, this is a piece of work that Peter and I, with, as you can see, quite a broad team from across Nottingham University, sponsored by the EPSRC funded Connected Everything project, has been looking at for, we're probably coming up to about 12 months now, isn't it, that we started the project. And as you can see, we've brought in lots of expertise, Peter from the Future Feed Beacon, myself, Oliver Fisher, Nick Watson and Sarah Sharples from Connected Everything. And then also we're able to benefit from the EDI. Nottingham University has a range of EDI coordinators that we've also been able to benefit from their experience from the project as well. So the reason why Connected Everything was really interested in this is that we took a commitment at the start of Connected Everything back in September 2019 that we would be ambitious and we would embed equality, diversity and inclusion into all of our activities, and we've done that in so many different ways. So we've found ways to make sure that if anyone ever applies for funding for what we do on Connected Everything, that we do that in a blind process. So when decisions are made, they're made purely on the basis of the science and the idea proposed, not who's proposed it or where they happen to come from. And we've also made a really concerted effort to collect EDI data from all the participants in our funded activities, so we can really track what's happening, what we're doing and what's working. Furthermore, Connected Everything leads something called a network of networks, which is 27 funded networks and hubs, largely EPSRC funded. And through that, we've actually built a community survey, a community EDI survey. So on that much wider scale, we can also see how we're doing and how we can make sure that all our activities are inclusive as possible. So specifically with Connected Everything, we strongly believe that diverse teams mean that we'll get better research outcomes. And we also think that that means that we'll have happy and healthy research teams as well. So we really want to encourage, support and respect ideas from everyone, ensure our inclusive activities are representative in our network community. However, one area that we realised, as I say, about 12 months ago, was perhaps in terms of the area of the research itself, was there more we could be doing? And that's when we started our conversation with Peter. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Deborah. And Deborah's going to sit down in front of her laptop now, which is on the call. So stick things in the chat, raise your hand if there's any issues. Deborah will shout at me and I'll be able to adjust things. Otherwise, if there's any issues with this, any questions, stick them in there as they occur to you, and then we can deal with those at the end. So that's a really good introduction that Deborah gave to the rationale and background for the project and how I came to be involved with this. And this is at the very start of the project, some of the starting points that I thought about in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion in research, and questions you might ask of researchers. So if you've got a research project, to ask the question, how inclusive is your work? Who does it include or exclude, and how does it go about doing these? how can it be made more diverse or inclusive, or how does EDI apply to me and my work? So the story there at the beginning of the project that I saw about how climate change, voices from the global south are muted by the climate science. So the people who are most affected by climate change issues from the global south may not have their voice heard, but it's dominated by sort of Western northern countries that are dominant in the science, so they are in fact being excluded from the research, to the detriment of that research as well. And this is part of a sort of agenda which I work in, sort of about thinking more widely about research, linked to research integrity, so issues of high quality trusted research, and the sort of wider agenda of responsible research and innovation, so which could be broadly summarised as, is your research ethically acceptable, societally desirable or sustainable? And I saw this as a project to help people think about these questions of relation and embed them in their work through the development of a tool, which is a sort of card-based tool similar to ideation cards, which I'll talk about in a second. And there's a previous example, which was the sort of inspiration for this as the starting point for this work. So this is a piece of previous work that I've done. I'll wave these at you. Got a set of the moral IT cards, which we term as a tool for ethics by design, for engaging with ethics in the design of technology. So this is a set of physical cards, very similar to playing cards, developed by myself and Dr. Lachlan Urquhart, who's now at Edinburgh, at the Horizon Digital Economy Research Centre at the University of Nottingham. So all the cards are set out like the example there. They have a title, an image, and then a question to get people to engage with these issues in relation to their work. So by using these, we'd hope that people would be able to consider the benefits and harms of their technology they may be developing or their research, identify safeguards and harms of ways of maximising benefits or minimising risks, and considering pragmatic challenges of implementation. And if you'd like more information about this specifically, there's a paper in the Journal of Responsible Innovation with a link to there. So, as Debra introduced, had some of the timeframes of this project. So the starting point was autumn, started with me sort of coming on board with the project and secured support from the EDI coordinators. Then through the process of winter 2021-22, the ongoing work presented to Connect Everything executive group testing, so as some internal testing, then researcher testing and EDI coordinators with expertise testing with that, which is we'll come on to in more detail later in the presentation. And as we have now, we've got a prototype complete. We're just in the process of getting them physically printed, and we want to sort of build on this to integrate into other EPSRC work and continue their development. As says, EDI is never done. It's more of a process rather than something that you can say, yes, we've got that all wrapped up, due to the complexity and issues at stake within that. So this links back to the key aims for developing these EDI cards. And again, these are linked with sort of the example of the moral IT cards we have here. So we talk about broadly 4 levels of engagement with EDI in relation to work. So raising people's researchers' awareness, so people know that these things are important, giving some people a bit of knowledge through the cards themselves of something that they need to consider, giving them some skills to answer some questions and respond to that in relation to their work, and then the reflective ability to maybe use the cards in a reflective session, sort of prioritise or rank or see which ones are important, and to place that in relation to their own work. So on the right-hand side of the slide there, we've got another example of one of the moral IT cards, and then underneath that is a complete sort of process board that we term with that, where people are selecting the cards, ranking the cards, annotating them with post-it notes, going through, identifying potential negatives, ways of safeguarding against these, and challenges of implementation. So they go through a session, complete as a group a session like that, produce a reflective piece, and this is a sort of the model for the EDI cards. So as similar to a set of playing cards used to with different groups to get different perspectives. So raise and discuss questions on a very basic sort of level, potentially do EDI by design. So we talked about ethics by design, maybe look back at a project and see what was good, what was less good from EDI point of view, and explore issues in current research projects and beyond. So some of the things, potential ideas that could come from the EDI cards. So in order to develop this prototype, and I stress it is a prototype at this stage, there's a lot more testing and refinement that could be done with this. Started off with me doing, and supported by the team, broad search survey of EDI approaches and literature. Thanks a lot to foundational work that Debra has done, from, and also from the University of Nottingham EDI documentation, legal aspects like the Equality Act and the input of the expertise of the EDI coordinators. As I highlight, I'm not an EDI expert. I've worked in other areas and developed cards and come across to this, so I benefited massively from their help. So the second stage was that after doing that sort of ongoing survey, development of a card deck structure. So from my experience of working with these ideation cards, this helped to break up the use of the cards and give some sort of internal structure to the deck rather than just a pile of 100 cards, for example, contributing to the 4 levels of awareness, knowledge, skills and reflection there. And it's based on my experience of using card decks. It could be considered them similar to a set of soups in the set of cards to give them a certain category. So this came up with a sort of a wide range of sort of probably 200 to 300 individual cards as ideas, and then there was a process of whittling down with support from the team and EDI coordinators to a more manageable set, and that's probably an ongoing thing that would need to be refined as we go on. Then there's the question of how we use them, development of the use scenario, and the testing, which is ongoing in development with that. So this, as it stands at the moment, is the broad deck structure that we have of the set of cards. So 4 broad areas, 12 categories and currently 145 cards. So divided into the 4 categories of definitions to help people understand the sort of the definitions of important factors in relation to EDI. Then people helping the cards to people define their scenario of what protected characteristics might be related to their work or other characteristics not from the Equality Act. What might their activity or context be? How might it include or exclude people? And because of connected everything's linked to the digital manufacturing context, some relationship to industrial digital technologies contributed by Ollie for this. And then as a pragmatic tool, asking people to think, what am I going to do as a category of cards? So how might I approach this and how might I measure the success? And then a recognition of the EDI being a potentially difficult and sort of not necessarily contentious, but there's lots of questions and practicalities that emerge from this that people need to deal with. So there's some cards to help people raise those and engage with them, potentially uncomfortable questions that people might ask in relation to this, and then again some specific challenges related to the digital manufacturing sort of discipline and area of where this all comes from. So over the next few slides, I'll give you an example of the cards, and then you can hopefully see how these all contribute to the deck overall, and then some results from the initial testing and the use case scenario. So each of the cards looks something like this. We have some examples here in the room. The examples will be on the slides as well. So each of them looks like this. At the top of the cards, they have an image, illustrate, provoke, provide an alternative perspective, and also make the cards memorable. So there's one with such and such an image on this. Then a title to name and identify the issue of the card, an explanation, some explanation underneath to give people information about what that means in relation to EDI, and then open questions to encourage people to put that card and that issue in the context of their work. And the idea is that the question can't be dismissed. It can't be yes or no, that's not relevant. You have to sort of come up with an idea of why. And all of these are divided into categories, which is highlighted by the label at the bottom of the card, and then they're all coloured, as in this case of other characteristics, by the colour of in this case, green on the back. So each of the cards looks like this, and then they're divided into the following categories, each from the example here. So we have some definitions here. So from a sort of technical perspective, these help people know what is meant by EDIs, and these include example definitions of equality, diversity, inclusion, and equity, for example, there. Then there's some legal definitions, so understand elements related to EDI from the Equality Act 2010. So these are the elements of protected characteristics, direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, amongst others. So moving on to defining the scenario of how people might be working with this in relation to their research. So these elements of the protected characteristics, these help people know what the 9 protected characteristics from the Equality Act are, and potentially relate these to their work. So, for example, disability, race, pregnancy, and maternity, amongst others there. Then there's also 13 other characteristics which are not under the Equality Act, for example, but this is to raise the fact that EDI is not just down to the Equality Act, it's wider than this, wider than protected characteristics. Other elements are also important. This is from the starting point of Nottingham's EDI information and work with that. So, for example, this includes physical characteristics, socioeconomic background, as you showed before, and neurodiversity. Again, part of the scenario is defining the activity or context in which people are working. So recognising EDI issues in relation to their own work and highlighting issues where EDI may occur. So in this case, it's research, so actual research methods, communications, how you might email people or talk to them, or maybe recruitment methods that have implications for EDI. Then there's getting people sets of inclusion or exclusion, getting people to consider how these things may become manifest in their work. So how it might include or exclude people, for example. So in this case, bias is the example. It could be physical inclusion or exclusion in terms of accessibility, and cards things like microaggressions or micro-invalidations, things which build up to be a much more serious issues, which may be seen as superficial, but in fact are incredibly significant in relation to that. So this set of inclusion or exclusion to complete the consideration of the scenario of what their work is in relation to EDI. Moving on from this, there's thinking, okay, we've set out a scenario. So broadly speaking, a question of what am I going to do to help improve these issues? And there's a couple of sets of cards within here to help people think about this, help people identify potential approaches to improve issues of EDI in relation to their work. So in this case, some examples include representation, support, however that might be interpreted, allyship, for example, and there's a whole range of 20 cards for the prototype set there. Then there's, again, what am I going to do in measures of success? I always think of defining this as particularly useful. A phrase that comes into mind, I can't remember exactly where it's come from, is be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. So there's just the ideas of what you're actually aiming for within this and how you're going to measure this. So it includes the goals and aims you might be working towards, how you might get feedback about this, or what data you might record to measure the success. Then we'll move on to the complications, practicalities. So identify and mitigate elements that might complicate progress towards improvements in EDI. So things like time, cost, how it interacts with other priorities here is another category of cards. And again, the complications and practicalities, getting people to engage with uncomfortable questions. This is one of the things that cards have found are particularly helpful in enabling people to do. They're sat around the table, for example, and they don't need to say, I think this is important. They think, I think this card is important. So they can play a card to deal with a question which might otherwise go unspoken. So, and particularly in relation to EDI, help raise potentially uncomfortable issues. So questions around avoidance of the issue, resistance to it, or a tick box rather than genuine engagement for that. And there's examples there. Then, as we mentioned at the beginning of this comes from Connected Everything related to digital manufacturing. So to ground this in this context, there's a couple of sets of cards in relation to particular challenges for digital manufacturing. So this set goes in the scenario elements of industrial digital technologies contributed by Ollie, which I really appreciate. And these things are things like AI, machine learning, automation, robots and cobots, which may specifically within that context affect issues of EDI, but maybe less important, but also elsewhere. So to help ground that within the digital manufacturing context. And then there's also a section in the complications and practicalities around digital manufacturing challenges, which are challenges specifically to the digital manufacturing space. So, for example, in this case, legacy systems, how you might finance this, or the digital skills and knowledge that are there or not there within the digital manufacturing area, and how these might impact and interact with issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. So that's all very well and good having a set of 145 cards at this stage. Some people have been asked when you sort of say, oh, that's very nice, but how do you use them? As I mentioned, think of the case of like a set of playing cards. You have one deck of cards and many games you potentially use them with, and we hope that people would adapt them to their own purposes and uses within this. But for the purposes of testing these in the initial tests, we used two examples based on previous experience. So a random draw to think of as an icebreaker type test to get people to relate to issues of EDI, and then an EDI by design, which is based on the moral IT card use process. These, as with every area of work, has been affected by COVID and the pandemic. The cards originally came from being intended to be used face to face, but we've also used this via the online whiteboard Miro, which you may be aware of. And this is how we tested the cards, as we'll see in the next couple of slides. So doing it via an online session, but we'd hope to do this via, when we get them printed, having people sat around the desk, doing it as a group in a face-to-face session, which we haven't been able to do for quite a while. So had two initial tests, one which is a group of digital manufacturing researchers who had maybe had less awareness of EDI, and one other group of people who had particular awareness of EDI and specialism in relation to their work. And they're complementary, and a contrast between those two groups is really useful in the initial tests of this. So the first thing we did ask people to do, almost thought of this as an icebreaker. We call it a random draw. So we asked people to, by giving a number and picking from a card, one or more cards from each of the set categories of definitions, scenarios, what am I going to do, and the complications and pragmatics. And as each of the cards come together, discuss how this combination of issues might impact or affect EDI. An example we have here is the card on the left is, not seeing that there, yeah, there's inclusion, so we drew that one first. Then we had the neurodiversity card from the other characteristics, and people say it's very much individual, the sort of neurodiversity elements there. Then we went on to draw the card of bias, and so there's a social bias, and try and anticipate social biases around neurodiversity. And then elements of support, and people reflected on the sort of, from a university environment, how there's administrative structures might help support people with neurodiversity needs around the bias they may experience, and then drew priorities as the final card of the complication for this, and seeing this, how this might complement or interact with other priorities of the work that people are doing. So we see that drawing these 5 cards at random, we get an interesting perspective from people's experience of how these things might build up to issues in relation to equality, diversity, inclusion, in relation to research and the academic or whatever environment they are coming from. So that was sort of, in terms of an icebreaker, it was a bit more of a substantive task than that as it occurred. But then we moved on to what we term sort of EDI by design, in inverted commas. This replicates the process we used with the moral IT cards. We asked people to identify technology of the project that they're doing, in the sort of line at the top in the Miro board here. So pick some cards to help them do that. Then identify some benefits, how it might benefit issues of EDI down the right hand side, annotate this underneath, and negatives of EDI down the left hand side, and annotate this underneath as well. Then underneath that, using the card again to identify ways of maximising these benefits, and again annotating them, ways of minimising the harms, annotating this, and practical challenges of implementation of doing this. So again, from practical challenges of maximising the benefits on the right and minimising the harms on the left. So this process is sort of intended to, although there's quite a lot of work as a record goes into completing that process board, the discussion and reflection is really valuable and important here. So this, I'm aware that nobody will be able to read this here, but this was a discussion around sort of issues of sort of AI-enabled technology to support people in sort of in need of care, and how it might sort of how it may sort of improve and sort of inclusivity around physical characteristics and things like this, but it may exclude people due to socio-economic background. So some of the complexities around these issues, for example, emerge from this. So having done these sort of 2 initial tests with the cards, some reflections and we need to do some more substantive work to refine these. They appear to work. They need more testing. So people were able to do these tasks, and able to actually follow the tasks and do them, and found them valuable. And they promoted really, really good discussions, which was really pleasing, because that's the ultimate sort of baseline goal of this. The contrast between the researchers and EDI, maybe think that perhaps different use cases for different audiences may be more appropriate. So a broad brush idea was maybe that the researchers found, maybe because they're from an engineering background, maybe found the idea of EDI by design, a task they could more get their teeth into, whereas the EDI, those with EDI expertise maybe had more experience for the first task to reflect more widely on EDI. But that's something that, very broad brush sort of idea, but gives us the idea that it may need to develop the use case appropriate to the audience. Also, as we recognise, there's a lot of information, and may need to break it down rather than just presenting people with a whole set of cards. Way of introducing this, or perhaps doing case studies. This is my reflection from actually having experience of doing these things face-to-face versus online. The actual dynamic of doing that is really quite different, has its advantages and disadvantages, which we could do to sort of try and pin down and build on. And so there's a very different interaction dynamic about people speaking over Teams, for example, rather than around a desk, or having one set of cards for people to share between themselves, for example. And one of the interesting things that came out of the online sessions is that people were able to use the cards to meet the goals of it, but they seemed like they were maybe participating less in the discussion, which is great that they can look at the cards and get their own benefits from it. But it was very different to a face-to-face session. So it's something that point of interest there. We were also really encouraged by some of the feedback from the participants that we had, which is generally positive. People thought it was a great introduction, structured approach to thinking about this, useful for early career researchers. People enjoyed thinking about these issues. People talked about the two different uses of them, being particularly the sort of helpful and reflective tool, and also more proactive in design. Prompted a lot of thoughts on how these things could be adapted to projects and support the individual projects themselves, which we hope that this tool would be adapted to a wide range of contexts, so encouraged by that. And one of the things particularly like I said, initially I couldn't really think of anything that would apply, but with this prodding a little bit, I saw how easily it could link to most things. So that sort of links with my experience of cards. People think, oh, I don't really know much about that, but you start doing little bits of the work, and then people can think about how it applies and get that awareness, knowledge, skills and reflective ability that we were talking about. More sort of things to reflect on and findings with this. One of the things that emerged from this we need to develop and think about is that with EDI, maybe the cards make it sort of something as a design or more abstract, and it was very sort of clearly highlighted that it's not a them EDI, it's an us, it's the group that you're working with may will experience issues of inclusion or exclusion in relation to their own work. So it's not an abstract thing, and that needs to be borne in mind when you're considering EDI in relation to these sort of things. Just because it's on the card, it may well affect somebody in the group as well, so we need to be aware of that. And this was highlighted, the need to build on this work and make the cards and processes accessible as possible, and to actually meet the EDI goals which we're promoting through the cards themselves. This was also highlighted that people only represent themselves, they can only speak for themselves and not necessarily a wider group, which is a wider known EDI issue. And people recommended getting people outside your group and area involved, outside your research group with this, and outside your sort of particular characteristics, if there's groups that may be able to give you input onto how the technology or research will interact and affect them. And then it's thought as ways of breaking it down and making it useful, helpful, case studies, or example, and pre-session guidance, for example, to warm people up or give people some ideas in advance to prevent it from being overwhelming, from just being bombarded with information in the first place. It was highlighted that people think it needs facilitation, so I was sort of prompting and running the workshops themselves. We'd like these cards to be something that people can independently use, so we need to think about how we set that up, maybe the case studies or clear instructions, for example, like that. And also, we thought these things went really well, but have to ask people, so what next? What are they going to do with this? So to some work to actually link this into people's work sort of more formally, and maybe ask them to do a commitment to do something different, or actually something to act on as part of their work. So the future plans for this work, get the prototype cards printed, which is imminent in terms of this, so that we can show them to more people, get people more hands-on with the cards, share this learning as part of today's event as part of doing that, and hope to keep testing, using, refining the cards. It's an ongoing process, and use this learning process to write this up in a future publication about the development and initial testing of the cards. So with that, I'll say thank you for listening, and if there's any questions from Deborah can take, or I think from the chat, or people have some